Welcome to All Things with Kim Strassel, our weekly opinion page podcast. And this week, in perfect time to discuss the ongoing fallout of that epic Oval Office meltdown between President Trump and Ukraine, President Volodymyr Zelensky, is New York Congressman Mike Lawler, a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee. Congressman, welcome to you from the land of upstate New York. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Kim. Appreciate it.
When it comes to Ukraine, I mostly want to talk to you about what comes next. But just to get your take on what happened on Friday, my own view is that there was a lot of blame to go around. Vice President Vance arguably should not have inserted himself into a meeting between two heads of state. Zelensky absolutely should not have taken Vance's comment as a reason to go off the topic of a minerals deal and into a full-fledged argument about future questions of security assurances. And Trump probably should have just shut this down. But your own view of how we got here.
Well, I think it was extremely unfortunate and really did not serve anyone well except Vladimir Putin, because the failure to sign the agreement in that moment was a win for Putin. And so, from my vantage point, I think it is critically important that this get back on track. I think President Zelensky's tweet today was positive towards that end. But, ultimately, any of us who have been engaged in foreign policy know that sometimes there are strong disagreements, even among allies, and contentious conversations. And oftentimes those take place behind closed doors. And so you don't have this type of, obviously, media fiasco that then followed. But certainly, I think this was a moment that was a missed opportunity. And, from my vantage point, we want to get it back on track quickly, because I think it is imperative not only to have the economic deal in place, but ultimately, I think the president is right to try and negotiate a peace and end this conflict. I have strongly supported Ukraine and continue to. I think the consequences of failure here would be catastrophic for Eastern Europe and the free world. I think other former Soviet satellite states would be in Putin's crosshairs, especially countries that border Ukraine. So, there's a lot at stake here. Tensions run high, but I think ultimately we just got to get this back on the right track.
You use the word imperative. I appreciate that word, because looking at this, it strikes me that this deal, this mineral deal, the economic piece, as you put it, is the only step that can be taken right now in order to get to that full-fledged peace deal. It's a necessary step. Do you agree with that notion? Zelensky seemed to want to jump ahead to a lot of other things, and I think that was part of the miscommunication, that this was essential.
Yeah, I think in some respects they were talking past each other. I think President Trump is correct that the economic agreement frankly strengthens Zelensky's hand in negotiations with Putin, and it ties the U.S. closer to Ukraine. And so, with that ultimately would come security considerations and guarantees. And so, I think it was just, again, it was unfortunate, but I do believe this agreement is vital, because at the end of the day, when this conflict is over, Ukraine is going to need significant investment from the United States, from Europe, to rebuild. And this is an agreement that, certainly is in the interest of the United States. It helps recoup some of our costs as we supported Ukraine throughout this conflict, but it also helps with the issue of critical minerals and getting the United States and our allies off reliance of China. So there's a lot at stake here. And I think people fail to understand something. They say, oh, Trump is a puppet of Putin, or, oh, this was intentional sabotage trying to embarrass and bully Zelensky in the meeting. This is an agreement that is consequential for President Trump, and it's something that he pushed for, and there's no reason why he wouldn't want to get this done. But it also is something that Putin certainly wouldn't want. He wouldn't want the United States signing this agreement. He wouldn't want greater U.S. investment and cooperation with Ukraine. So, I think people are failing to recognize, in part, because they focus sometimes on the way the president says something or his approach. But the fact is, he is trying to prevent this conflict from escalating and from devolving for Ukraine, and in fact strengthening the U.S.-Ukraine relationship.
Does he still want this deal? You made the argument that he did, but in light of what happened, he has broadcast a kind of take it or leave it approach. How much do you think he still cares about getting this done?
No, I think he understands how critically important this is for the U.S., for Europe, for the free world. Oftentimes, I think people don't fully understand how he approaches foreign policy. Number one, he's somebody who does not believe in war. He does not support endless wars. He's been clear about that. He is willing to use our military when necessary and is willing to strike when there are threats against the United States or our interests. But he's not somebody who wants prolonged war. He also takes great umbrage when he feels that the United States is being taken advantage of, and when our allies are not necessarily ponying up to the level that they should. And I think here, with respect to this situation, I think that is a large part of what is driving him in the decision making that he is undertaking.
I want to go back to Donald Trump's vision here in a minute, but on Ukraine, what does need to happen now in order for this deal to come back together? What does Zelensky have to do? What are the circumstances that this gets fixed?
Well, I thought President Zelensky's tweet today was very constructive and helpful towards addressing some of the concerns that came out of Friday's meeting. I think he made clear he wants peace. He wants to work with President Trump to negotiate that peace, and that he's willing to sign the agreement today. And I think that's an important step towards getting this back on track. I think the president certainly understands his responsibilities as leader of the free world and understands the threat posed by China, Russia, and Iran, and the unholy alliance that they have engaged in. And I think part of what he's trying to do, if it's possible, is to kind of back Russia out of that arrangement, out of that agreement that they have undertaken with China and Iran that undermines and destabilizes the U.S., Europe, Israel, and the free world. So I think the president is focused on advancing the ball forward. I certainly think he understands the need to get this deal done. It's why he pushed his administration to negotiate it. And I think if cooler heads prevail here, this will get done quickly.
We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, more with Congressman Mike Lawler. Welcome back. I am Kim Strassel, and I'm here with Mike Lawler, a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee. Could this have, surprisingly, any positive effects? And I mention it in this regard in particular. After everything went pear-shaped on Friday, Zelensky obviously departed and he went to Europe. And you saw the Europeans offer their support, I think also probably in private some words of advice, how to dig himself out of this hole. But it also seems to have, in some ways, inspired the Europeans to maybe be thinking a little bit more earnestly about their role and what position they might play in some sort of ultimate peacekeeping agreement or arrangement. Would you say that that's a possible benefit of this, maybe?
Look, I think President Trump certainly has a unique way of forcing our allies to think about their responsibilities and the role that they can play, and not just relying consistently on the United States to provide, cover or military support. And ultimately, I think if it forced a stronger commitment and greater dialogue amongst allies about everybody's role and responsibility, then yeah, I think that's a positive outcome of a rather unfortunate situation. And again, one of the things that I think President Trump was successful in his first term on was getting our NATO allies to understand the importance of upping their military investment as a percentage of their GDP, and recognizing that they too need to play a role in their own defenses and in defense of Europe. And, frankly, had President Trump not pushed for that during his term, I don't know that Europe would have been prepared to help Ukraine, frankly. And, obviously getting the javelins to Ukraine prior to the invasion was critical in their ability to defend themselves early on. So there's, a lot here that I think, despite how he may say it or the words he uses sometimes, I think there's important lessons to learn from all of this.
Just for listeners that may not have seen that Zelensky tweet, to make sure they understand the context for what you're talking about here, he did put out a tweet today. He said that he'd like to reiterate Ukraine's commitment to peace. None of us wants an endless war. He said he was willing to work fast to do that, threw out the possibility that the first stages could involve a truce in the sky and in the sea. Did say how much they appreciate Americans, especially Donald Trump, providing javelins, saying that the meeting in Washington did not really go the way that it was supposed to go, and saying he would sign that deal anywhere, anytime. On Donald Trump's vision, I want to ask you this last question on foreign policy, and then we can talk a little about what's going on in Congress. We ran an editorial on Monday entitled Trump's Old World Order, which we wondered out loud what vision Donald Trump actually had for the world. Because during the campaign, he talked a lot about peace through strength, rebuilding our military, making America strong again internationally. But I think since he's been in office, we've also seen some hints, which to me are a little bit more worrying, that he might be fine in a world in which Russia is free to exert influence over Europe and China dominates the Pacific realm and the United States dominates the Americas realm. That is a bit of a return, if that were the case, to the great power competition that we had leading up to World War II. I wonder, as you look at him from your perch on foreign affairs, do you have a sense of what his bigger vision is beyond these questions of immediate peace, for instance?
Look, I think he certainly recognizes the threats posed by China, Russia, and Iran to global peace, stability, and economic prosperity. I think when you look at how he approached Iran, for instance, and how he is approaching it again, his objective is to cut off their oil supply and the illicit oil trade with China and cut off their source of funding for their terror proxy network, for their nuclear weapons program, and for their missiles program. When you look at Russia, he talked about the fact that so long as Germany and other European nations are reliant on Russian gas, they are going to find themselves in a difficult situation. And we see here in this war against Ukraine, the Europeans are funding the war by purchasing Russian gas at the same time they're trying to support Ukraine and defend against it. And obviously the threats from China, he was, frankly, the first president in a very long time to take an aggressive posture against Beijing and President Xi. So I think he looks at it from the standpoint of, yes, how do you make a deal? How do you get an economic advantage for the United States? I think you see that through what he's doing with respect to tariffs. I think his philosophy is obviously first and foremost to protect the U.S. and make sure that we are benefiting from the decisions that are being made, whether it's with trade, whether it's with foreign aid and military aid or otherwise. And so, I think he certainly supports the alliances that we have, but I think he wants to hold our allies to account when it comes to their financial commitments and military commitments and economic trade, and making sure that, in fact, it is to our benefit as we support others.
We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, more with Congressman Lawler and the U.S. Congress. Welcome back. Okay, let's turn from the disorder around the globe to the disorder in Congress. The government is going to run out of money for fiscal 2025 in about 9 days. Congress had a chance to deal with this at the end of last year. It chose to punt it to this year. And now Republicans run the Senate and the House. Have Republicans made up their mind yet on the best way forward, which is to say a continuing resolution, keeping things at current levels until the end of September, at the end of that fiscal year, or actually trying to come up with some sort of appropriations funding solution?
So there's been significant negotiation between the House and Senate, as well as House Republicans and House Democrats. And the objective was to try and finalize fiscal year 25 appropriations, pass final appropriations bills, and move forward. I think in those discussions, Democrats wanted to use it as an opportunity to exert leverage and control over the executive and try to rein in some of what the executive is doing with respect to spending within departments and agencies and trying to find efficiencies. And so, I think in the immediate, the objective is to keep the government funded, which is why I believe the Speaker is going to move forward with a clean continuing resolution, clean CR, to keep the government funded through the end of September for fiscal year 25, which would keep it at current levels, and then turn our attention to the reconciliation bill and fiscal year 26 appropriations so that we can start implementing some of the reforms and changes that the executive is undertaking. I think from my vantage point, it's obviously unfortunate that we can't find an agreement between Republicans and Democrats. And the reason that's necessary is because of the filibuster in the Senate. And because, frankly, we have some, Republicans in the House that won't vote for a CR and generally won't vote for appropriations because they think, we spend too much. And they're not necessarily wrong. But obviously, when you're in a position of power, you have to govern and you have to pass legislation. You have to be able to make compromises along the way. And so, I think we're in a situation where ultimately it'll be a clean CR put on the floor, and folks are going to have to justify why they would vote against that, why they would vote to shut down the government. And Chuck Schumer, certainly, as the Senate Democratic leader, will have to explain why he would advocate for Democrats voting against a clean CR in the Senate, other than because he wants maximum leverage in a negotiation. But if it's a clean CR to keep the government funded, I don't really understand how anybody can object to that.
Well, one objection, and I understand your point about those who vote against continuing resolutions simply because they have a position of voting against continuing resolutions, which, as you say, is no way to govern. But there is a legitimate policy argument against a continuing resolution, and that is that it locks in sequester rates, including for military spending for the rest of this fiscal year, which is potentially very problematic for the defense budget. Is that not a legitimate concern?
That is a concern, and certainly, obviously, a legitimate one when we look at the threats around the globe, but that will be addressed through reconciliation. We will plus up the defense spending through reconciliation, which is in part why I'm not as concerned about that as a rationale to vote against the CR. And so, it's certainly something to address, but that's what we will address through reconciliation.
Well, congratulations, by the way, on that budget reconciliation bill. I have to say, I did not see it coming.
Ye of little faith.
Me
Yes.
of many years who have watched Congress. I was sort of beginning to grow comfortable with the notion of the Senate two-bill solution as possibly the only way that this got done. So anyway, I was pleasantly surprised to see that it got done. I think it's a great step forward. You are meeting next week for a start on those negotiations. Obviously, that budget reconciliation, though, let's be honest, Congressman, that was the easy part. What is the timeline here? Do you really see this happening this spring? My fear is that that was the easy part, and we now have this high stakes. One way to put it is President Trump talks about a big, beautiful bill. I see a now giant high stakes bill in which, if this doesn't get done, the president's border priorities, his defense funding go down the tubes, and we get a $4.7 trillion tax hike.
Look, this is going to be the most consequential bill we pass this Congress. We'll address the president's priorities as well as Congress's, from border security to strengthening our military to increasing domestic production of energy to providing middle-class tax relief and, of course, reining in the size and scope of the federal government. The budget resolution that we passed was the first step in this process. And to your point, it may prove to be the easiest step in this whole process, but certainly it was a necessary step to begin to unlock the reconciliation bill. And we still have a little ways to go. The Senate and the House have to agree on a budget resolution. So we ultimately are going to have to pass the same thing. And I think there'll be a little bit of negotiation on that, and then we'll advance the ball forward again and take it from there. But the bottom line to me is this is the most consequential thing we will do. You know, we all have our priorities. Part of my priority is to lift the cap on salt, you know, and
I was just going to go there.
You know, that's something President Trump fully agrees with and has made it clear to leadership he agrees with that. And so, you know, that's going to be part of the negotiation. And that's obviously a priority for me in my district. But ultimately, we're going to have to all find compromises along the way to get this bill passed. And, you know, as I've said many times, anybody who's ever been married knows you're not going to get everything you want. You have to find compromises along the way. And that's just the reality of a negotiation. And so all of us are going to have to put on our big boy pants and make hard decisions, but, you know, ultimately get a bill together that we can pass with 218 votes.
Well, that is a question I want to ask you, because I do want to go out talking about salt. I'm not going to ask you to defend why people like me should have to help subsidize the taxes in your state, but I am going to ask you about just that issue of compromise, which is, I think this is a thing when I talk to Republicans, they're most concerned about is that you have a block of members, including yourself, from salt states, that if they don't get most of what they want on salt, this bill is in trouble.
Look, I've been very clear from the beginning that if salt is not fixed, I will not vote for a tax bill.
There you go.
In large measure, and I'll tell you exactly why. Because if the tax bill expires, the cap on salt is lifted entirely and it goes unlimited. But
you guys get everything you want, and everyone else gets a $4.7 trillion tax
Hold on,
hike.
let me finish. But this is why I am willing to negotiate in good faith, because with that would come the largest tax increase in American history, inclusive of bringing the alternative minimum tax back. And so I understand full well we're not going to get unlimited. We have to negotiate in good faith, and that's why we're working with Ways and Means to come up with a number that addresses the issue, that covers most constituents throughout, you know, my district and others, and really provides tax relief. On the issue of subsidy, I would just note, number one, this is double taxation. Number two, New York sends more money to the federal government than it receives back. There are states like South Carolina, for instance, that gets more money from the federal government than it ever sends in tax revenue. So, you know, when we start talking about subsidies and who's subsidizing who, we can have that political argument if we'd like. But to me, at the end of the day, this is an issue of fairness. It's an issue of double taxation. And I fundamentally believe we as Republicans should be fighting to provide tax relief to Americans, regardless of what state they live in.
Well, we can have a debate about double taxation some other time. Lots of people are double taxed on lots of things. And by the way, I will take you and raise you. I am all for getting rid of salt and getting rid of subsidies to states so that we can all play on an equal playing field. But that is a subject for an entirely full podcast on another day. Thank you, Congressman Lawler. We really appreciate your time.